the best advice I've gotten in naval aviation is to underreact in the extreme. You have to, whatever the case might be, you have to make a deliberate effort. And it's a learned skill to underreact. And that's both in the airplane, where if you see your whole panel light up with every single warning light there could be, we'll kind of jokingly reference that at that point, we're supposed to sit on our hands. Because if you just take a minute and your mind is going so fast in that moment that you're a million miles an hour, and all you need to do is take 1 second to just say, okay, what's going on? If you do that, you're going to see the picture more clearly. If you immediately just start pushing buttons as fast as you can, you might end up shutting off the good engine instead of the bad engine. You might end up doing something with your aircraft that you can't correct later because you rushed through it. So by saying, I'm on fire, my aircraft's falling apart, I've just had a mid-air collision with another aircraft, let me compose myself, understand what's happening, and then I'm going to execute my emergency procedures in the correct way.
So that is former two-time Blue Angel Frank Weisser. You talk to this guy, he's so calm, he's easygoing, so matter of fact. You could be talking to a professor, a consultant, an operations manager, for God's sake. You wouldn't think of this guy flying hundreds of miles an hour, inches from other aircrafts, pulling 7Gs and flying close proximity to the ground, like 10 to 20 feet off. It's insane. In other words, he doesn't look or sound like that adrenaline junkie or that extreme daredevil that you might conjure up in your mind. At least I do. He's in fact quite normal. And as you'll find from listening to the interview, it's actually pretty normal to be normal in this elite group. That's what makes it all the more fascinating. So buckle up. This is a really, really exciting one. And let's dive in. My guest today is Frank Weisser. Frank is a two-time Blue Angels pilot who was deployed in combat 3 separate times, including Afghanistan and Iraq. He has accumulated more than 5,000 flight hours and nearly 500 carrier-arrested landings. His decorations include multiple Meritorious Service Medals, Strike Flight Air Medals, and various personal and unit awards. Because of his experience flying at extreme low altitudes and inverted, he was the pilot for the most complex and memorable air combat scenes in Top Gun Maverick. His book is titled Lead Solo, Learning Life's Vectors from an FA-18 Blue Angel Aviator. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show where I interview world-class leaders and trailblazers to discover the ingredients of outsized performance. I'm Glenn Zweig, a leadership advisor and executive coach, and I'm here to help each of you unlock your own potential. That is, your own version of excellence. Okay, here we are. We're live. Frank, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you for having me, Glenn.
It's a pleasure to have you. So, I got to start with what is top of mind for me right now.
Okay.
You were the primary stunt pilot in the recent Top Gun Maverick movie. I had been waited, I don't know how many years since the first one. It was one of my favorite movies of all time. So, for starters, what was it like working with Tom Cruise?
I was quite impressed. I had no idea what to expect. In fact, anything I probably would have expected was ultimately proven wrong. In terms of the actors, the set, the layout, how everything worked together. But for Tom specifically, I, once again, had no idea I couldn't even anticipate what I was going to be working with and dealing with. But I found him to be one of the most genuinely decent and hardworking people I'd ever met. And if I was surprised by anything, it was just the fact that the man doesn't seem to have an off button. He just goes and goes and goes. And we would have really intense days flying together. And in very short, compressed times away from flying and debriefing and briefing, he would be on calls with heads of state and following projects. And he's in the middle of filming the next Mission Impossible while doing Top Gun Maverick and was bouncing all over the world. And there just doesn't seem to be, like I said, an off button. He just, is an incredibly intense guy.
Frank. Says the former two-time Blue Angel and naval aviator who lands on aircraft carriers this is an intense guy. Of all
Exactly.
the people,
That's right.
you,
Everything's relative.
yourself included. It's interesting coming from you. Were you starstruck at all? Just it being Tom Cruise?
No, I think I did have a slight benefit from the starstruck aspect. My first year on the Blue Angels, I was the VIP pilot, and that's a position on our team where our number 7 pilot flies a 2-seat airplane, and for an entire year, you give hundreds of rides to actors, athletes, celebrities, anyone who by just being creates their own media. And so I'd had an opportunity already to sort of work that out of my system, I feel like, by being around some people where they walk up to the airplane, you're like, oh my goodness, I know you, you don't know me, but I've seen you a lot on whatever it is. So I don't think in that particular case that was one of my issues. I had other challenges, filming for that movie, but that wasn't one of them.
Well, to clarify for those that think there was just a lot of CGI in the movie, there was not.
There really wasn't.
These were actual flying sequences. This was all you. You are the stunt pilot. And I had to rewatch some of these scenes. And Frank, you're putting yourself in some pretty precarious situations, to say the least. Very, very little margin for error. And by the way, I mean, it blew me away. It was fascinating to watch it, and especially knowing that there was a real person behind it. But here's the question. So I get subjecting yourself to heightened risk for the military, fighting for your country, huge, lofty mission like that. If there was true risk here, and it seems like there was, you felt that was worth it filming an action movie?
Yeah, great question. And yes, but as I was telling you right before we started, I did a presentation yesterday for a large aircraft manufacturing company on their safety stand down, and the whole subject was risk mitigation in the making of Top Gun Maverick. And so I opened it with the fact that aviation is inherently dangerous. The minute you lift off the ground, you're accepting a degree of risk, and that's known before that. How you manage that risk, how you mitigate it, that's the important part. And as it relates to Top Gun Maverick, I couldn't agree more. There are situations where we're on the deck of an aircraft carrier. The weather is so insanely bad they'd never ever launch you. But it turns out that there are men and women under heavy fire in Afghanistan, and now the mission is required. And so you're launched with an incredible amount of risk involved, and it's known risk, and off we go. But for a movie, I could make a pretty convincing point, I think, that there's no acceptable risk at all. It's a movie. So then how do you take this known risk and mitigate it? And one of the things they did, you mentioned that I flew in some of the scenes, but I wasn't the only pilot. There were a number of Navy and Marine Corps pilots that flew in this movie. And what the Navy did a great job of was assigning the subject matter experts. When they filmed the dogfighting scenes, the head of the dogfighting division, for lack of a better term, at Top Gun, who is the most proficient, most experienced, most highly trained dogfighting pilot in the Navy, flew those scenes with Tom in the back. Who better than that to do that? Nobody. And so the scenes that they brought me in for were the ones where they needed an aircraft at an extreme low altitude. And the Blue Angels do that better than anyone. And it's not hard to fly low. It's the same as flying high. But the level of risk is increased because these aircraft are so dynamic. It can climb at 50,000 feet per minute. So if you're 10 or 20 feet off the ground with hundreds of people out there filming and world famous actors, and you're not really comfortable in that environment, then you're inducing unnecessary risk. So my involvement was just because I was a risk mitigated solution for them. But we didn't take any unnecessary risks, and I can go into that with you. But the amount of preparation before those scenes, everything I flew was extreme, almost to the point of diminishing returns, where for weeks leading up to scenes I was going to fly, I'm preparing for it, I'm looking at imagery, I'm going to the simulator at Pax River where our test pilots train, and prepping for that.
How many feet off the ground were you in the scene? The closest you were was how many feet off the ground, roughly?
The lowest was probably the takeoff scene that was ultimately, and we can talk about CGI, but there's a scene at the start of the movie where Maverick takes off in this Mach 10 spaceship, essentially, and he blows the roof off a building and dusts the admiral who had come to shut him down. And that was definitely the lowest I was because I was just feet off the ground for that takeoff maneuver. And then there was a scene in the desert that was, it was kind of the end of when he stole the jet to run through the canyon. And I was 10 or 20 feet off the ground for that scene. And there was dozens of Paramount folks out there with really heavy duty cameras and the liaison for the movie and the aerial coordinator and the commanding officer of Top Gun. They're all there for these scenes because of the risk associated. And more importantly, the head of all of naval aviation, our 3-star air boss that owns every airplane and every person, wanted to brief before and after each of those events because he appreciated that level of risk.
Well, I was impressed. I was impressed with Tom Cruise. I'm now as equally or more impressed with you, knowing who's behind doing all this. So I want to rewind the tape a little bit. And you knew at a pretty young age you wanted to go in the military. It seems like you knew you were going to go to the Naval Academy. You went to the Naval Academy. You actually went with the intent to become a SEAL. And I've had some Navy SEALs on the show as well, including the guy that knocked off bin Laden. It seems like you really had your heart set on that. You weren't accepted. And it seems like you were pretty devastated. So just to start, why were you so set on becoming a SEAL? What was it about a SEAL that drove you at that time?
There were a couple things. This was in the 90s, and so the SEALs weren't as well known. After 9/11 and OBL and those sorts of things, then they became more prominent. But everything about the mission seemed exciting to me. I wanted to be fully invested. I felt very much called to serve my country, and I felt very much called to give everything I had. And the SEALs, to me, what I understood about them seemed like you had to have a bit of everything. You had to be mentally strong, physically strong. You had to appreciate the brotherhood, and you had to be willing to give it everything you had. And at the same time, my hobbies, for lack of a better term, were exactly what the SEALs did. I was skydiving, I was scuba diving, I was climbing mountains. All of those things were what really got me going. And so what better way to serve your country than in a meaningful way when you're doing things you love to do? And the other aspect was that I had never necessarily felt a draw to fly aircraft. I didn't come from a family that had the means for me to learn in high school or as a young man to just fly. So it's not something I'd ever done. Some of my friends from the Naval Academy who were exceptional pilots, I hopped in airplanes with them and flew to the drop zone so I could go skydive. So they would fly us there, and then I would get to skydive on a Saturday when we didn't have class. But yeah, it was devastating. To your point, I was wrecked. It was the most important lesson I ever learned, and I learned it at age 22 in
Did you get any feedback? Did they tell you why you weren't accepted?
No, that's not something they do. And moreover, there are people who I would have gladly given my SEAL spot to in my class that also didn't get it because I knew them to be better than me. They were just better prepared. I had been selected the summer before my senior year to go to what they call mini buds. They take 30 people from the Naval Academy to go out there and get a 1 month sense of what you're going to do. And I was around some of my classmates who were just exceptional. The only sense I had, if I could put it on one thing, because I felt like I had done what I needed to do. I was positioned properly academically and physically, and the normal metrics they pull from. But there is an aspect at the Naval Academy for what your second choice is. And a best example of that is the Marine Corps. If you want to fly airplanes for the Marines, generally speaking, at least the logic was back then, that you had to put Marine pilot first, but Marine ground second. And Marine ground could be anything, infantry, logistics, intelligence. Because the Marine Corps wanted you to want to be a Marine more than you wanted to be a Marine pilot. And so there was a sense at the Naval Academy that if you wanted to be a SEAL, your second choice should be surface warfare. You were willing to go to a ship for 2, 3, 4 years and serve your country on board a ship and then transition later. But if you put down pilot as your second choice, SEALs was out. Because they're not going to spend millions of dollars to train you to be a fighter pilot and then allow you to just arbitrarily decide you want to do something else.
Right. Well, what I thought was amazing is, so that was your backup choice, being a naval aviator, and of course you got it, and the rest is history. So I am guessing, and you can correct me here, Frank, I'm guessing you might have been the only one accepted into that program that didn't have it as their first choice. That had to be everyone else's dream job, and that's your backup. Am I right?
Well, I don't know of anyone else who had it as a second choice that comes to mind right away. I do have a friend from the academy who wanted to be a pilot and went SEALs because of an eyesight issue. Up until the class of 2001, you had to have perfect vision to be allowed to fly airplanes. And it's actually heartbreaking because I have a couple of really close friends who had 20/30 or 20/40 vision and hundreds or thousands of flight hours and weren't allowed to be a pilot.
Well, you described in order to get over the disappointment that you had of not getting into the SEAL program, you reframed the job from being all about you to being more about serving your country. And if you're serving your country as the primary motivation, then the specific job you have, whatever you're assigned to, becomes secondary to that mission, which completely makes sense on paper. Was that easy for you to do? Did that take time to do? Did someone help you with that reframing? Would love to hear about that.
It took a lot of self-reflection. I don't know that there was one person in particular that I went to. I kind of went on a calling tour of family and friends one by one to just go through and say, I didn't meet this goal. I wasn't selected to to go to the SEALs. And it was hard for me at 22, when I'd wanted to do it since age 12 to 22. It doesn't just feel like you failed at one thing. It feels like your whole life is a failure. You know, you picture that period in a young man's life, it feels like your whole life. And so to fail at your one life's goal and to have no opportunity to recorrect it, it's not like normally in life, and we can talk about this more, but when I give talks, it's a lot about failure. I have a whole chapter in my book about failure and the benefits of failure. But that particular one, there was no way to correct it. It just was. I wasn't going back that way. And actually for years as a fighter pilot, I would have dreams. I'd wake up and in my dream, they called me while I'm driving into work at Oceana and said, hey, we've got a spot in this next Buds class. Do you want in? And I just like flipped a UE on the highway and started driving to Southern California and called my wife and like, meet me in San Diego. We got our shot. And there was a point though, at some point when my life changed and it redirected and I was really, really satisfied and happy with flying airplanes. But when it is your life's goal, it's hard. But to your point, I did have to learn an important lesson, which was I do believe I joined the Navy to serve my country for the right reasons. But I also wanted to serve it in the manner which made sense to me, which was for me as a Navy SEAL. And the lesson I had to learn was it wasn't about how I served, it was simply that I served. And actually, my service means a little bit more if I'm doing something I don't want to do for the right reasons. And so that was I didn't read a self-help book or anything. I just spent a lot of time in my own head and in silence and quiet thinking through my future as a future of something I hadn't necessarily wanted to do. And when I was able to make sense of it in my mind, then I think it allowed me to accelerate down the ultimate path.
It means more because you feel like you're making more of a sacrifice?
Correct.
Is that, yeah? Mm-hmm. Interesting. So you don't obviously go into that program and then become a Blue Angel. And in fact, I thought it was very interesting that you quite struggled through the program early on, almost failed out of it, I think on a couple occasions.
Multiple times.
So, but you stuck with it. And you have to fly for a number of years. You were flying on aircraft carriers and doing all sorts of missions. I don't know if you did the combat before or after your Blue Angel stint, but I'm curious in terms of getting into that Blue Angel program. How does one become a Blue Angel? How are they assessing your flying skills, if that's a piece of it, I assume, and then what else do they look for beyond just the technical mastery?
So you're right on all accounts. You can't go straight into it. My time flying in combat was before and after. And the Blue Angels are sort of a one-off job that we would do in place of traditional roles. So the general schedule for a pilot is you learn to fly, then you learn to fly your specific airplane. For me, it was the F-18. And then you serve your country by flying that airplane. Traditionally 3 years, and that you're on and off aircraft carriers, you're deployed, then you're home. And then after that, you have for the first time a little bit of your own decision on what you want to do. And the traditional jobs are a flight instructor that's teaching other students how to fly the F-18, or it's to go out to Top Gun and either stay there as an instructor or be a tactics instructor at one of our 2 bases, or you can go to test pilot school, or a handful of other one-off things. The Blue Angels usually fill in then, with the only stipulation is that we require a higher degree of flight time. We're looking for experienced pilots. And the reason is, when things go wrong in an airplane, generally speaking, if you lose an engine at 30,000 feet, it's pretty easy to manage. You've got a ton of time to sort it out. If you lose an engine at 100 feet, when there's other airplanes in your immediate vicinity, you have to really know your aircraft to be able to respond appropriately. So we're looking for more experienced pilots. And then what happens for us is people who are interested, who have met the basic requirements, can apply to the team. And so the team gets right away all of their information. We have every single flight they've ever done, every grade they've ever received. We get references from their squadron, so we know how they fly. We don't put them through a flying test, but we already know more about how they fly than probably they do, because they might not have even seen all their grades recently. And then we put a lot of effort into making sure that we go to all of their Navy fleet counterparts and make sure they're up to snuff. It is really important to us. You could have the greatest human being in the world that would be a tremendous asset for the Navy and Marine Corps and a great representative that could really spread our mission and our reach. But if they can't fly the airplane safely in the air show, we don't need them on our team, because that has to be first and foremost. You have to safely execute the air show. The air show is just this mechanism that allows us to do all the other important stuff. And so that's the requirement. But then the next aspect is, how do we meet the right individuals that have the right passion and sense of purpose for it? And we do that by bringing all of our applicants to us. So we go through a process of 3 or 4 months where they must come and spend 2 or 3 weekends with us, because we're really just trying to see if we gel, if we work as a team, if we can get along 300 plus days a year, and if they're going to be the right person that can go out and inspire young men and women.
So why you?
That's a great question, and I have no idea. I do think that if I had applied the year after, based on who did apply, I wouldn't have been selected. And likely the year before, I wouldn't have been selected, because the people before and after my year were exceptional. And so I don't actually have any idea why they chose me on my year, aside from perhaps it's better to be lucky than good. I did have one fleet friend who had applied a couple of years later, who I was talking to during this application process. And I said, I wish you had applied, a year or two ago. Why now? And he goes, well, I never thought I could make it. It's the Blue Angels. But then I heard you got on, and I was like, well, shoot, I can try. And I thought, well, that's a backhanded compliment, but I'll take it, for what it's worth. And so we have to manage the makeup of our squadron. And if everybody is OCD, if everybody is too relaxed, you have to manage the overall mood and the overall sense of things. And so we pull the right people at the right times.
So if a big piece of it is looking at that technical proficiency, looking at your grades, how did you do on all the different exercises over time, all the different missions, you're still separating, the wheat from the chaff in a very elite group to begin with. So help me understand from that aspect of it. And again, there's another aspect in terms of how you represent and your ability to go along with the, with the cause and be a good representative in the public and all this sort of thing. But in terms of the actual flying, are the people that get to that level that separate themselves, the best grades, the top scores, the top marks, is there some just innate natural ability to fly? Is it just practice? Is it intensity? What can you give me some sense in terms of what that looks like to get the people that it's hard enough to get into the program, to get through the program, but to then climb your way up to the upper echelons of it? What does that look like?
I think yes to everything you just said. It is, you have to have some natural ability, but one of the things the Blue Angels do better than most organizations, when you're in Navy flight school, you're graded to some degree on how fast you learn, because you might have 10 flights that teach you how to fly formation or drop bombs. But if you do really well, if you're exceptional right out the jump, then your grades are higher for your first 5 or 8 flights. Whereas if you're a slow learner, grade-wise, you'd be reflected as a worse pilot. But by the end, you might be better than everybody else. It just took you a little bit longer for it to click. Air Force flight training is slightly different. They will weight their final check ride much, much higher, maybe 60, 80% of the overall grades, and we don't do that. And that's really relevant, because we had an interview one time with a pilot who I thought would make an exceptional Blue Angel, and one of the questions was, we're looking through your training jacket, and all of your time flying formation, you had average or below average grades. Why would you think would take you on the Blue Angels? And his comment was, I'm just a slow learner, but once it clicks, I've got it, and I can execute better than most. And so for our team, we start with new pilots in November, and we have until middle of March to be ready for that first show. So if it doesn't click the first flight, if it doesn't click till the 50th flight, it's not necessarily a hindrance for us, as long as we have some confidence that it will click and you'll have it at that point. But yes, of course, you have to have a natural ability. And also, one other aspect is you have to be willing to push your comfort zone. We have the number 7 pilot, like I mentioned, who gives backseat rides to media personalities, but they're going through a really set executed flight where it's a loop and then a split S and then a roll. And it's kind of a build-up process. But in our air show, it's really intense. And we almost never fly with people in our air show, even on a practice day, unless they have experience in the aircraft. So for example, some of my closest friends from the Navy who were F-18 pilots with me, I had the opportunity to put them in the back seat. And you can have guys who've flown thousands of hours in the F-18 over 10, 20, 30 years, and they get into the airplane for an air show, and they get really quiet because they're so uncomfortable with what you're doing with that airplane. And because it is so abnormal, we're so close, or you're so low, or you're putting this aircraft in these really remarkable positions, because to make something look cool on the ground, it has to look absolutely insane in the sky. You could have a case where a pilot flies home to see his parents, and he comes over the runway and does our brake turn to land, and it might be 4 or 5, 6 Gs, and he says, "Mom and Dad, did you see that? Was it incredible?" And they said, "Did I see what?" "We saw you turn left. Is that what you're talking about?" But to have it look like something people are going to pay $50 to go attend, in the airplane, it looks really, really nuts. To the point where our diamond pilots can sit in their seat, and the canopy is exactly 1 fist above their head. We move our seat with the toggle switch up and down until you're at the right seated height based on your personal body. And if you were to jettison the glass, the canopy off the aircraft, that pilot could reach up and grab 2 airplanes from his seat. It's that close.
Oh, and it's insane. It's insane. And in fact, beyond reading your book, which, by the way, I love the book, I rewatched for a second time the Blue Angels documentary, which I'm guessing you must have seen.
I have.
I think it was last year, the year before. And yeah, and you could see how close it's like inches away. It's insane, going hundreds of miles an hour. And so speaking of the documentary, one of the comments someone made in that documentary was how everyone comes into the Blue Angels as this highly accomplished pilot, like we talked about, but the place is a great equalizer. So you've got to really check your ego at the door, it seems. Yeah,
you definitely do. I think as military individuals, or even naval aviation, you get really used to being your own harshest critic, but the Blue Angels take that to the next level.
The signature motto of the Blue Angels is "Glad to be here." It seems like it's something that you just say all the time throughout. What does the phrase symbolize? What's behind that? Gratitude
at a very basic level. Gratitude and appreciating that you're in a position that offers you some really incredible opportunities. It offers you an incredible chance to go and recruit the future of our service. But if you don't appreciate the position you've been put in, then it's going to be lost on you. When we're hiring new Blue Angels, I would often, if someone has wanted to be a Blue Angel their whole life, if they joined the Navy to fly airplanes to be a Blue Angel, my experience was they didn't make great Blue Angels because it was about them, not about the mission. So you have to put the mission first. And we end almost everything we say with, "I'm glad to be here." And it creates a culture of camaraderie, a culture of excellence. Another thing the Blue Angels do is when we show up to work, you go through every single space and you greet everyone with a handshake, you look them in the eyes, and it becomes this very warm, personal culture where it feels like a team. I mean, at its core, the Blue Angels is a high-functioning team, more than any other team I've ever worked with. And it's just these learned principles over years. Good organizations change. Great organizations change slowly. And they've got a great organization. They can institute one small benefit every couple of years, and it makes the great organization great. But everyone has to raise themselves. To your point about the comment made in the documentary, you have to check your ego at the door. And for someone who's not used to doing that, it can be a pretty painful process.
And it's probably a fine line because you've got to have confidence. I mean, if you lose your confidence, you're dead. So it seems like you're straddling this line of extreme confidence, but not spilling over into cockiness, that kind of thing. Which, right? I mean, because
you're exactly right.
Okay, yeah.
It's a self-correcting machine too. So when you have 15 or 16 officers working together, if one person starts veering towards the cocky perspective, they get brought back into check pretty fast by people who have their best interest and the team's best interest in mind. So it isn't as if one person can just go rogue. I haven't seen that happen. You have people who, unfortunately, whether it's totally true or not, in my opinion, wealth, money, power, alcohol, or drugs, they make you more of who you already are. A good person who comes into great power or wealth becomes a great leader or a generous individual, but a bad person becomes a bad leader or a toxic leader. And so the Blue Angels, to some very small degree, have that ability. You have this really minute kind of fame where if you walk into a crowd in your flight suit at the right venue, you get mobbed. But if you take off this show suit, which is essentially kind of a clown suit, when you take off this skin-tight blue flight suit, no one has a clue who you are. So you get this little peek into what it's like to be famous, where people are mobbing you and asking for autographs and pictures. Mm-hmm. Unlike someone who's actually famous, you can take it off pretty easily. But there are some people, and it goes to their head, and then they start, talking about themselves in third person, or thinking that for some reason they're actually something special rather than they're just a normal knucklehead like everybody else, and they're just given a really cool position, and that's why they should be glad to be here.
Hmm. So a little inside baseball here for those that don't know. They don't wear G suits in the Blue Angels. This is a really, really big deal. So not everyone is a aviator enthusiast like I am. So first, explain what a G suit is, why generally it is worn when you're flying jets, and then why is it not part of the Blue Angels protocol?
Sure. So when you're flying in any kind of high performance aircraft, the effective G on your body can cause you to lose consciousness. And we feel G's in different vectors. So if you're in a space shuttle and you're going to the moon, you're laying on your back and you're feeling the G through your chest, it doesn't affect you necessarily. If you're a NASCAR driver and you're driving on a track, you're feeling G centrifugally into the center of the track. As a pilot, when you're turning, whether you're climbing or turning level, you're feeling G's in the Z-axis through your head. And what it does is it pulls the blood out of your head and into your lower extremities. And in doing so, it causes the risk of passing out. So the way we combat, and the average person is around 4 G's. 4 to 5 G's is your traditional resting G. If you're experiencing G's on a roller coaster, let's say, you're probably in the 1.5 to 2 G's, where you feel yourself pushed back in your seat and you get that sense of G forces. But in an airplane, you'd probably be fine. You'd be uncomfortable, but wouldn't pass out till around 4 or 5, depending on the person. The G suit functions like, it looks like chaps, like a cowboy, where it goes around your midsection and it goes around your legs. It buckles, it zips, you get a really tight fit with the help of your para-riggers. And then it connects into the airplane, into an anti-G system. And then under G, the airplane it inflates this G suit. And what it does is it squeezes your stomach, it squeezes your extremities. And in squeezing, it prevents blood from going down there to the same degree it would without having it. And so that gives you an extra 1 or 2 G's of protection. But the pilot also has his own capabilities to flex his leg muscles, flex his core, and breathe in such a way that it allows you to combat the G forces without the G suit. Blue Angels specifically have chosen not to use them for a couple reasons. One, we have a lap belt that goes around our waist. And in a traditional F-18, you have 2 coke fittings that click to your harness on the left and right side, kind of by your hips. But they don't get tight enough that if you were to roll upside down, you wouldn't come out of your seat. And we fly upside down a great deal. And so to be inverted and in level flight, you would essentially fall out of your seat and be unable to control the aircraft. A lap belt functions almost like a gunner's belt, where it's thick. It's maybe 6 inches. It has a locking mechanism that can be ratcheted down. So you have to make it before you take off so uncomfortably tight that it becomes a thing. It needs to be so tight that it's uncomfortable. And you taxi out. By the time you're airborne, you don't notice the discomfort anymore because you're flying and your body has shifted a little bit. But that lap belt alone allows us to fly inverted. And if we had a traditional G suit on, it wouldn't work because it would try to inflate. And we have tried it. We had a couple of admirals who insisted that we try flying with the G suit. And it felt like 1,000 needles into our legs and stomach all at once. It was incredibly uncomfortable. And the other aspect is we fly in a really bizarre fashion in the Blue Angels because of a spring. We add this spring as a Blue Angel modification to the stick. It pulls up from the floorboards. Once we get to the highest setting, it weighs between 30 and 40 pounds. And so then you're doing a right-hand curl of 30 or 40 pounds with your stick to just fly level. And so regardless of how strong you are, it's not ergonomically friendly to just try to do a curl for this whole flight. So then you end up resting your right forearm on your right thigh and to get just a lever, to get some control. And then to do that properly, you have to bring the rudder pedals all the way forward. Traditionally, when you get into any airplane, whether it's an F-18 or a Cessna or a Gulfstream, the pedals should be just far enough forward that you can touch them and get full deflection, but they don't cause you to bend your knees. We have ours come so far forward that you're basically in a seated position. Your knees are almost in your chest. And it's really awkward when you do it the first time, but it becomes really comfortable once you do it more and more. And so by putting your right arm on your right thigh, you have better control of the stick. You can fly in close formation. But if that right leg were inflating with a G-suit constantly throughout the flight, it would be putting you in a position where you couldn't fly correctly.
Well, again, back to the documentary. During the training program, when you first become a Blue Angel, they put all the new pilots into this machine called a centrifuge, I think it's called, to simulate the G-forces that you'll actually experience doing some of these maneuvers as a Blue Angel pilot. And this is where you do the training. They do it at first with the G-suit on, and then they go ahead and take it off. And several of these pilots are passing out. I mean, several of them are passing out doing the training without the G-suit. So you're really, really pushing the envelope. And I get that, you know, it's more training and more practice, but there's no risk of actually passing out in the show. No one's ever passed out. Like once you've learned how to do it, it's not a problem.
No, there is a risk. And going back to our first conversation, aviation is inherently risky. So there is a risk. Can we mitigate that risk to some degree? Yes. Can we control it? Yes. But it is always a risk. No question about it. The first year I joined in 2007, we had a mishap that year where the pilot died. And the mishap report did connect it to not a full loss of consciousness, but a partial loss of consciousness due to G-forces. And so there was a very intense push, one, to have us into the centrifuge every single season, but also we had Russian powerlifters coming to us and Navy flight docs and medical physiology folks teaching us the right ways to better our body. And as it turns out, to combat Gs, the best thing you can do is just be short and squat and built like a Russian powerlifter, truly, because your body is able to withstand those G-forces. The shorter distance between your heart and your head, the less likely you are to pass out. Ironically, the higher your blood pressure is, the less likely you are to pass out. I gave a backseat ride to a gentleman who was an editor of a paper in Meridian, Mississippi, and was probably one of the most unhealthy people I'd seen up to that point. And the last thing he did before he hopped in the airplane was smoke a cigarette. And we get in, I'm preparing him for this G. Ultimately we're in a 6 or 7 G turn, and he comes up on the radio and he said, "When does the G start?" And I'm up front. I do this for a living, and I'm hanging on by a thread, giving it everything I've got. And his blood was so thick that it wasn't even moving. And so someone who's an ultramarathon runner is going to really struggle with high G-forces. Someone who's a powerlifter is going to do better. And so they put us onto a pretty regimented weightlifting program, 6 days a week, deadlifts, squats, that sort of thing, to combat the Gs. And to take it one level further, I went back a second time under unfortunate circumstances after one of our pilots crashed. And this was I moved back on very short notice in 2016. I got a call from the commanding officer who had been a close friend of mine and a pilot with me in my first squadron, who said that it's very likely I'm going to go back. The first thing I did before I even told my wife was I went to the gym and got on the squat rack and started doing squats. That was the most important thing in my mind that I could do at that very moment, because I was living in the Alps of Germany and I would go for 4-hour skis or bike rides or runs, but that's not the best thing you can do for your body. The best thing is to have core and lower body strength. And so I recognize right then, if there's any chance I'm going to fly this airplane safely, I've got to get back onto this heavy weightlifting regime.
Well, I want to go back to it. You said something to the effect of you're sort of hanging by a thread, and here's this guy in the back, no troubles. Because I would think that even when you learn the technique, it seems like from the outside looking in, it would take so much concentration just to stay conscious while you're experiencing all these Gs. I mean, you watch like just the people, just the breathing techniques and what their face is doing. And like you said, lowering yourself, center of gravity, and all these things that I would think it would drain you of so much of your mental energy. You wouldn't have much left over to focus on all these, life and death maneuvers. What am I missing?
That's the learned skill set. You're exactly right. It does. When someone's learning to fly an airplane the first time, they'll get backed up on talking to the control tower or something. We say aviate, navigate, communicate. And so you'll misprioritize. And so to your point, in that case, you have to prioritize the G. And then you have to fly the airplane. But the reason we take pilots with 1,000 plus hours of experience is because they have the experience to know how far they can push it. And the reason we go to the centrifuge is to know how your personal body reacts. Under heavy G, some people tunnel, where they'll see everything's clear and then they'll see dark on the periphery, and it gets darker and darker and closes in on them. That's not how G affects me. I start to like scintillate, I sparkle. I'll see, one little bright light, almost like a shooting star, and then two, and then more of them. And then everything is bright until you pass out. And so could I pull a certain force on the stick and see a little bit of sparkle and know I've still got 1 or 2 G's left? Yes, I could. And so then you begin to learn what your body's capable of and how to push yourself. And then some days are better than others. It's a physical endeavor like anything else. So some days, if you have proper nutrition and you've had proper exercise and proper rest and proper everything, then you feel better in the airplane. So that's a really critical aspect of the Blue Angels. We're benefited by the fact that we fly at 3 p.m. every day. So you never have an excuse not to get a good night's sleep. But all of those physical aspects, it's a hard airplane to fly. It's a hard air show to fly. But it is physically taxing. And you can get out of that aircraft after an hour and you're just totally drenched from head to toe in sweat.
So I know this is one of these apples and oranges questions, but it's not going to stop me. I'm going to ask it anyway. Compare the skill it takes to land on an aircraft carrier. And we're talking an aircraft carrier, it's moving all around, there's waves, maybe it's even at night. It's its own hairy beast. Compare that to the skill it takes to perform some of these extreme maneuvers that you're doing as a Blue Angel.
They are very analogous to one another, and we reference that pretty often.
Oh, okay.
The level of focus that we have landing on the aircraft carrier is absolute. When once you're overhead the boat, you're focused on the boat. But when you come into land, you have a minute or so of the most intense focus of your life, especially when it's nighttime, even when you're coming straight in. The level of focus is paramount. You're not worried about anything else. You have rid your mind of every possible distraction there is. And in the Blue Angel air shows, it is identical. And it's not just what we're doing in front of the crowd. If we design a perfect Blue Angel maneuver, it's relatively easy to fly, but looks great, meaning it's repeatable by our lowest common denominator aircrew. We can't fly it. We can't design a maneuver that only the greatest pilot in the Navy can fly. You have to design maneuvers that basically every Blue Angel we pick can fly. But some of the hardest stuff we do, the crowd will never see, because it's the rendezvous that happen behind the crowd. How we get 2 or 6 aircraft back together in a really rapid fashion with high angles off, with no ability to, if you mess it up, you don't make that next maneuver and then something's off. So that's really challenging. So there are periods of intense focus when we're flying these maneuvers. But then we also, and we speak to this, we had performance coaches come in and talk to us about it. You have to be able to find periods of intense rest also. You can't have 45 minutes or an hour of laser-like focus with not a single distraction. You have to be able to find 5 seconds here, 10 seconds here, where you can just go. And often that's coming off the crowd line. You've readdressed the formation. You have 2 or 3 seconds. You might grab the stick with your other hand and shake it out because your right hand is so sore from this 40-pound curl. You might take a breath. You might decompress, and then you're back at it. But without periods of intense rest, you can't have the intense focus. But to your original question, I very much feel like almost every single Blue Angel maneuver is akin to landing on the aircraft carrier.
So just stick with that focus theme for a second here, because you mentioned another aspect of the ability to have this kind of extraordinary focus is to compartmentalize. What does that mean, and how does that work?
We brief to that a great deal. We talk about how we compartmentalize our distractions, because once the canopy comes down, you can't focus on anything other than flying this air show. And so then how do you take all of your distractions and put them into a box? And we brief through it ahead of time. As a team, we will go through and fly every maneuver. We talk through every maneuver. Keep in mind that these are 6 pilots and 16 officers who have flown the same air show every day, hundreds of times together. Could you walk out to the airplanes, not even see each other, all meet at the airplane, go take off and fly the show? Yes, you could do it. Would it be done as safely? Would you have mitigated the risk? you wouldn't have. So we talk through every maneuver. We're in our chairs, like you see on the documentary, almost a meditative process where we're chair flying. You have your hand on the throttle, your hand on the stick. You're going through with the right voice calls, and you're visualizing how to do it. And in doing so, you've now compartmentalized the fact that whatever my distractions are that day, and it could be a personal distraction, something with your family or your kids or your dog. It could be a professional distraction. You have to get certain things done to be able to promote to the next rank. We have other collateral jobs. You have lots of things that are distracting you from your time. But if you're able to prioritize properly, and it's a learned skill. It's something you have to do, and you have to recognize in the moment, I found myself distracted when I shouldn't have been. I'm going to now have to find a way to rid myself of this distraction. And so by preparing ourselves as a team, that's the first step. The next step is we will, in the same manner we would debrief, where we identify our own failures and our own weaknesses, we have to be open and honest about distractions. So as a group, we'll go through and say, are there any safeties or risks to flight today? Do we have any human factors? Glenn, is there anything on your mind that's bothering you right now? Did you get a good night's sleep? Are you having any issues at home? If you have a problem that might be a distraction for you in the air, you have to tell the whole team. And then as a group, we're going to decide if we're ready to push forward. And so that's a really emotional and almost intrusive process that we know makes us safer as aircrew, that we have to be honest with one another about our human factors. And so once you've done all of that, now you've learned this technique of ridding yourself of distractions so that when you get into the airplane and strap in, you can be solely focused on the task at hand for that period, knowing that there's dedicated rest after. You can worry about all this stuff later, but it's almost like taking your phone and putting it on Do Not Disturb. Whether you're filming a podcast or whether you're working out, whether you're on a sales call, whatever the case might be, if you know right now I can't have any distractions, that's what we do in the jet.
Well, I was going to ask you, how do you extrapolate from that? So, you've got the seat flying, like you mentioned. You have where you go around the room and everyone shares what might be on your mind, et cetera. If you're just on your own, you have some big meetings, some big pitch, something you've got to focus on, but there's a lot going on in your life outside of that. What is the technique? What does one do when you don't have that group dynamic that sort of enables you to compartmentalize? For
me, it's about priorities, and I kind of address this in the book to some degree. But then I listened to lots of other individuals talk through this because I do think it's relevant. But being able to identify what's on your mind, whether it's the morning paper idea where you're writing down everything that you're thinking about when you wake up or when you go to bed. I had read something years ago that I really took to heart, which is if you readdress how you evaluate your daily decisions, and instead of saying I didn't have time, you say that's not a priority. And it could be something as simple as I didn't go to the gym today, I just ran out of time. And said, I didn't go to the gym because it wasn't a priority to me, or I didn't read my daughter a bedtime story, that wasn't a priority. It in fact changes how you're approaching each and every decision we make, because we make thousands of decisions every day about how we spend our time. But what it comes down to is how we prioritize. Our time is our most valuable aspect of our lives. We each have that same exact amount. How we choose to spend it, that's our decision. But if I'm prioritized properly, meaning I know that for this hour or for whatever I'm doing in business, I'm a real estate developer and a Gulfstream pilot, and I do a handful of jobs. I know at certain points in each of these different daily tasks that I have to be focused on this. I have to be able to rid myself of all these distractions by knowing what my priorities are in that moment. And so I'll write down, I do it constantly. I have so many lists on my phone of this is my priority. These are daily priorities. These are long-term priorities. These are short-term. But if I'm clear in my mind about what my priorities are, I find myself not to be distracted.
Okay, let's move on to fear. How do you manage fear when you're in these high-stakes situations? Or does the fear kind of dissipate over time with enough practice and repetition?
I think the latter. I think when you're properly prepared, you don't have anything to be fearful of. Preparation is such a huge aspect. Preparation comes into focus. Preparation comes into the trust piece. But to be prepared for things to go wrong, I cover in the book how aviation deals with things going wrong. And we have a terrific way of dealing with it, where before I ever got into an airplane, doesn't matter what it is, prop, jet, big, small, you learn all the systems, and then you learn what could go wrong. And it might be 20 or 30 things for this airplane. These are the things that if they go wrong, you have to know what to do right away. and they're memorized. And in some cases, when we're doing that pre-flight preparation, you'll have to talk through them in front of everyone and go through these memory items. So when you're prepared for that, and you've studied it, you've been evaluated on, and then you get into a simulator and you're tested. And the simulator is obviously one of the greatest inventions for the risk mitigation of aviation ever, that we can run all these scenarios and not have to have you experience it for the first time in real life. Now, granted, there's always this aspect of I'm not actually going to die. I'm in the simulator, so you might do things you wouldn't normally do in the aircraft.
Yeah, there's that.
But at least going through the muscle memory of knowing I know what I'm supposed to do, and now I do it. So that when it does happen, you just execute. Your brain-body mechanism becomes one, and you execute. So from a fear perspective, you have to know what to do. If you're not prepared, then I do think you would be more fearful. Then at the same time, bad things have to happen to you. The reason we ask for 1,000, 1,250 hours of Blue Angel pilots is we want them to be experienced enough where bad things have gone on in the airplane with them, so that when it happens to them in close formation, close to the ground, it's not the first time they've experienced it. And then I think the final piece is that we deliberately work through how we're going to react to situations. And the best advice I've gotten in naval aviation is to underreact in the extreme. You have to, whatever the case might be, you have to make a deliberate effort. And it's a learned skill to underreact. And that's both in the airplane, where if you see your whole panel light up with every single warning light there could be, we'll kind of jokingly reference that at that point we're supposed to sit on our hands. Because if you just take a minute, and your mind is going so fast in that moment that you're a million miles an hour, and all you need to do is take 1 second to just say, okay, what's going on? If you do that, you're going to see the picture more clearly. If you immediately just start pushing buttons as fast as you can, you might end up shutting off the good engine instead of the bad engine. You might end up doing something with your aircraft that you can't correct later because you rushed through it. So by saying, I'm on fire, my aircraft's falling apart, I've just had a mid-air collision with another aircraft, let me compose myself, understand what's happening, and then I'm going to execute my emergency procedures in the correct way. And so we do that. We do that in Navy airplanes, no fast hands in the cockpit. I fly Gulfstreams part-time, and we're in big airplanes with high net worth people in the back. You're taking off from France, flying to Asia or California, and you lose an engine on takeoff. The one thing you can't do is overreact. If you start screaming, holy crap, we're all going to die because you've lost your engine and you're hot, heavy, everything's bad, well, then you will. But if you say, I've lost my right engine, execute engine out procedures, I'm flying the airplane. If you handle it and you deliberately lower your voice and you talk slowly, you are now forcing yourself to underreact, and you're forcing everyone else, you're lowering the blood pressure of everybody else involved in this problem. And if you were to listen to the Blue Angel comm, where we're constantly talking throughout our air show, a great majority of the pilots will deliberately talk quietly and calmly and softly, because it has this ability of, it calms the whole formation despite the intensity of what we're doing.
But I imagine when you're going at that speed, in that close proximity, and something goes terribly wrong, I get the concept. But you don't have a minute to sit there on your hands and think about it, right? I mean, we're talking like a couple seconds, if even that. I mean, you've got to somehow be able to calm yourself down and process and plan, and then actualize that plan within just a few seconds, right?
Yeah, actually 1 second is enough. If you're a Blue Angel, if you're my wingman and I was training you to be a Blue Angel pilot, I would tell you even 1 second is already enough for you to take the moment to pause, account for what's going on, and move forward. And as it turns out, an aspect of the Blue Angels is we fly the oldest airplanes in the Navy. And that's a very deliberate design. We want the newest, latest, and greatest, most advanced airplanes to go straight out to aircraft carriers to be deployed in combat. That's where they're needed. The airplanes that have served their purpose that we can't really use anymore, that's what we're flying. And so what goes along with that is the fact that they've been beat up pretty hard. They've been flown for 10, 20, 30 years. They've got thousands of hours on them. So things are naturally going to break. They've been sort of ridden hard as aircraft. And so things go wrong all the time. I mean, I can't count on both hands how many times I've lost engines or had pieces fall off the aircraft, or serious emergencies happen, not just to the airplane, but in close formation with other airplanes. And so you get really comfortable being uncomfortable.
I like that expression. It's one of my favorites. Let's talk about trust. And it's obviously critically important as a Blue Angel. And when you're coming in, I assume there's just not any time for someone to earn your trust, given the high stakes environment. I mean, you're literally having to trust your co-pilots with your life day one. So you've just got to automatically trust people, period. And hopefully, it's well deserved. So I find in the real world, let's say the corporate world, for example, it's quite the opposite in most instances. So I tend to trust people day one until they prove me wrong. But I find with most people, it's not the case. Most people, you've got to earn their trust. They don't give you the benefit of the doubt. I find you have to sort of earn it over time. So the question is, how do you go about compressing that trust building timeline? You could talk about what happens in the Blue Angels, but I'm also thinking, how does that apply in real life, in a corporate setting, let's say, when you don't necessarily have the luxury of time. There's a really important project, there's a critical deadline, et cetera. You're working with people you haven't worked with before, you're a bunch of strangers. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I think obviously I called it high trust in the book, and that was a term from a Blue Angel boss of ours who coined it. But I definitely think it matters in the corporate setting, and to the degree that I can say the Blue Angels are a high-functioning team, and if I'm trying to share what I learned from that organization in a corporate environment, trust is almost the first thing I can say. If you're trying to take your team, your organization, your company to the next level, it should start with trust. And the reason, and it often doesn't happen because people are uncomfortable or it makes them feel vulnerable. And I agree with you. I do think also that decent, good, honest people are more inclined to trust others, and people who might not be quite as decent or honest themselves might be less inclined to trust others. That's natural. But if you're going to mitigate risk, if you're going to address dangers, whether it's company or aviation, the trust piece has to exist. I mean, risk and trust are inextricably connected. You can't have trust if there's no level of risk involved. And so then you can't mitigate risk without having trust. But blind trust also, by the same token, doesn't work. And if I gave you just a very quick Blue Angel analogy, it would simply be that I trust my wingman because I know his background or her background, and I know that they're capable of flying this aircraft, and we've gotten to know them personally. So that piece is already there. Also, we put them in a room and we made them debrief themselves. And if they go through all their own weaknesses, what they've messed up for that day, and better yet, if they identify things they screwed up that I didn't know about and no one else would have ever known about, they've now made themselves vulnerable in a very special way where they've now put themselves in front of us, and now you automatically trust them. So that piece matters too. But then in the airplane, our very first time we have a cross, where we're crossing with 1,200 miles per hour closure, we're not 3 to 5 feet apart. We're 200 feet apart. And we do that dozens of times, consistently. And in consistency, you develop trust. Bring it closer this time. Let's do 150 feet. Let's do 100 feet. Let's do 50 feet. And by being consistent, we build this trust. So now the way to mitigate that risk is through earned trust. That if you just place blind trust in someone, it truly will not work, in my opinion. But as a leader of a company, a team, an organization, if you want to see your business succeed, you have to trust people to the point where you're empowering them to do things that make you uncomfortable. It's easy as the junior person to trust your boss. That almost comes naturally. They have this positional power. They wouldn't be in charge if they hadn't been successful before, so you trust them. But it's harder when you're the boss to trust the people underneath you. But if you want to see, and some of them might not deserve your trust, and you have to be willing to fail by placing your trust in them, having them do something wrong, and then saying, okay, well, now you've lost my trust. But the other people that I trusted that I might not have normally done that without pushing my own comfort level, they have now exceeded my expectations. And now that's a horse I'm going to ride, because this person is showing me that they can achieve more than I initially thought. And so that level of trust in any organization, I think, is absolutely paramount to make that team take it to the next level, to rise to the level of a high-functioning team.
There's a really interesting practice that they do in the Blue Angels, and you sort of alluded to this earlier, and I'm wondering if this also helps. But it's this concept of a post-show debrief. Not where you're practicing ahead of time, but afterwards. You're done with the show, you're done shaking hands, taking pictures, signing autographs, all that. My understanding is then you go together in a room, you rewatch the video of the day's performance, and you go around the horn and each person says what they did wrong. Not what they liked, not what they felt good about, but what they did wrong. Where you've, let's say, failed to live up to your responsibility of being a Blue Angel. I don't know that such a thing exists in the corporate world. I've certainly never experienced it. What's the goal from that exercise?
The goal is to grow as a team and improve as fast as possible. And in doing so, we've learned that you can accelerate your growth, and our goal every day is to fly the perfect air show. And we haven't done it. We were formed in 1946, but tomorrow's goal for their team is to fly the perfect air show. And what we've learned is that if you focus on what you're doing right, you're not going to improve quite as fast or at all. If you did it right, we have to assume you're going to do it right again tomorrow. If you did it wrong, then we can learn. And so when we go through, and oh, by the way, to your point, we do that. And most importantly, it starts with the commanding officer. The most senior person does it first. And in doing so, now they develop the trust and the consistency and the respect of everyone around them by saying, I'm willing to start. You know some of the things I messed up today because you were next to me in my airplane when I did them, but you might not know that I messed up these other things too. Mm-hmm. And so by being your own harshest critic, by admitting your mistakes, when it comes to debriefing our air show, we don't have to cover those things. I don't have to say, yeah, you were too low on this cross, because you've already told me that. And I listened to you when you said that. So you've already said that. Now, tomorrow, we're going to brief to the fact that you've been low 2 days in a row. So today, I want you to show me a high. That's a naval aviation thing we call bracketing. If you do the same thing wrong 2 or 3 times in a row, you have to deliberately err to the other extreme. So now you know the bounds. And now you're going to find what is correct. And so in doing that, it's really impressive. And it's impactful on the squadron because it allows people as a team to come together. It's also liberating as an individual to be able to say what you did wrong. You get it off your chest. You're not holding the secret. And so it allows us increased trust. It allows us better performance for the next day. It allows the debrief to go faster, those sorts of things. And the other aspect of what you mentioned is we sit around and watch our tape. But this is really important to me, and I foot stomp this because it's very uniquely Blue Angel, is that our debrief, as a pilot, I can come back from a flight and tell you what I messed up, what I did wrong. I saw this, I saw that, but it's all what I saw. And I could debrief a Blue Angel air show that same way. But our debrief is cameras that are located throughout the crowd, because we're flying this air show for the spectators, not for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And if we didn't do what looks right to them, then we haven't done our job right. So we use as our debrief tool someone else's perspective, and it's a really cool aspect of our air show.
So what do you do if you saw another pilot do something that they shouldn't have done, but they either didn't see it themselves, they don't have the self-awareness, or they do and they didn't want to admit that one thing? Are you supposed to then point it out? Is the point? I mean, obviously you're supposed to own it yourself, but if someone doesn't own up to something, or again, maybe they're just somehow they were blind to it, is that part of the process that, hey, we should have an open environment where we could all feel free to critique one another?
Definitely. There's no ego and there's no rank in that room. And it doesn't matter. There are lots of cases where the person who has positional authority, the number 4 pilot, the slot pilot, is teaching maybe number 2 and 3. And that person might be very junior to them. Oh, by the way, the commanding officer spends most of that debrief having people tell him or her what they did wrong. And everyone in that room is junior to that person. And so, to your point, yes, it's imperative on every single member of that team, if you're trying to hold each other to the highest standard you can, in almost every case, if they didn't bring it up themselves, it was just, you're going through an hour's flight and you're listing 30 or 50 things that you saw or did incorrectly. And it's very likely that you missed one or you didn't name it. And so you generally say, I felt like it was this. And 99% of the time, they're going to say, you're exactly right. Sorry, I left that off of my debrief. But you also have to learn the communication skill of having constructive criticism. If what you're saying isn't meant to help that person and the team, then you shouldn't be saying it. You have to only offer up input that's meant to be well-intentioned in that sense. If you're just trying to be, trying to take strikes at people, I almost can't even verbalize that properly because I never saw it happen on the Blue Angels. As a culture, we just didn't do that. If it's a thing for individuals, it gets rooted out so fast, it wasn't a concern for us.
Okay. Well, you mentioned earlier part of the trust building is being able to fail and come back from that and this sort of thing. And you talk about in the book the courage to fail and how you can't really succeed until you face failure along the way. So if you look inward, what would be your most public failure? And how did you recover? And of course, we covered early in your life the not getting the sales. But in terms of once you became a pilot, what does something stand out?
Gosh, I kind of, as you said, not achieving my life's goal at 22 was, in my mind, the biggest failure of my life. I had so many other aviation failures that are, I kind of go through them. I almost failed out of flight school multiple other times. What I found was, with each failure, if I was willing to apply those lessons I learned, I failed less frequently. And a better example of that is when you start learning to fly, one day you have a great flight, the next day you have a terrible flight. What was different? I don't know. The next day you have a great flight. And the ebbs and flows, the sine wave is huge. But the more you fly, the more it dampens out. And so for me, from aviation failures, I felt like they dampened out. I had fewer and fewer as I went on. But that's not to say they ended totally. But anytime I tried something new, I retired from the Navy in 21. I went into real estate development, general contracting, construction, commercial development. I knew nothing about the industry, but I wanted to at least prove to myself that I wasn't a one-trick pony and all I could ever do was fly airplanes for my whole life. And I had so many failures in real estate and in development that, and in that case, it wasn't just a failure professionally, it's a failure financially. When you invest large sums of money into a project real estate development is pretty simple. It's just a complicated equation. If you can identify the variables and manage it, you can usually do okay. But then there's always this, what you can't control is the macro aspect of what the market's going to do in the big picture. So I've had tons of failures outside of the Navy in other endeavors. The only thing that I think one of the great truths is if whatever you're doing is not working, you have to try something else. And I kind of mentioned that in the book. I think it's a fighter pilot technique, but it's also true in business and in life. If you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, then you're the one who's messed up in this equation. And so how do you succeed? Business to me is easier than flying in the sense that if you fail at something, try something else and keep trying. The only way you're going to ever truly fail is by giving up. And there's the great expression that, if you ask for help, you're not giving up. In fact, you're doing the opposite. You're refusing to give up by asking someone else for help. And so, the list of my failures is probably too long for the rest of your podcast for your life. But the blessing in my life has been that I'm not afraid to fail. And so, And I learned that early on. I learned that by failing at the most important thing in my life at a young age and saying, I'm not afraid to fail. I kind of talked through this in my book. I do think one of the best examples that I could share with someone from an aviation perspective is when we build this new airplane, whatever it could be, it's the X something or other that they're designing right now. The smartest people in the world, they design it. The best mechanics build it. And then the best pilots go out and test this thing. And I spent yesterday with some folks at Bombardier doing this incredible tour of some of the best airplanes ever built. And the things they're doing with them in a test sense are just mind-blowing to me. Someone who's flown for my whole life, really intense test flying, really exciting and dangerous stuff. And they're pushing this airplane to the absolute limits. And our test pilots do that. They take off in the newest F-18. They go up to an altitude where the airplane quits. The engine's shut off. They can't generate lift. They push it to its absolute extreme. And in doing so, we figure out what the airplane can do. And what's dawned on me through all my failures is the fact that human beings are no different. We just don't know what our own personal envelope is. We can determine what the airplane can do, but we don't know what we can do unless we push ourselves to the point where we're going to fail. But the cool thing about the human spirit is that when we reach a failure point, that's not our envelope. We're not fixed in that forever. We can always learn from our mistakes, and we can grow and we can overcome any challenges, any failures we've had. And so it's relevant individually, but it's also relevant from the team perspective. As we're talking about how teams deal with this level of trust and how we can incorporate different aspects to create high-functioning teams, well, if you're the leader of your group and you're not encouraging everyone underneath you to push themselves to the point of failure, then I think you're not doing your organization a service. You have to not only encourage them to fail, you have to reward them when they do fail, because you recognize that you pushed that person, that team so hard that it found its own envelope. And I really do think that matters. And so for me, if I'm not failing in my business ventures, I'm doing something wrong. I'm not trying hard enough. And I have to teach myself and be firm in the fact that I know I'm going to fail. But if I don't fail, I'm not trying. I'm not trying hard enough, at least. So
let me take that. So Frank, you're walking into a high stakes situation. with life and death consequences, which is not real estate development, but it is landing on an aircraft carrier in the middle of the night when there's no lights on in a moving ship, going up and down. That's high stakes. Blue Angels, high stakes. Combat mission, high stakes. So there's very, very little room, little margin for error. So failure in these contexts, have to be incredibly microscopic failures. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're dead. So when you're going into these situations, beyond obviously all the years and years and thousands of flight hours of practice and all that, anything you do to get yourself in the right mindset as you're going into the situation, not in a group setting, not with others, but just you're about to get in the plane, you're about to buckle up, anything you do just to get yourself in that complete, not just focus, but the courage, the confidence, all the things that need to come along, with the focus. But anything?
I think having a routine matters. I think being able to do the same thing. You see basketball players when they shoot free throws, they always do it exactly the same. That allows them to be focused in that moment, right? For us, Blue Angels, our preparation is identical every time. It's guarded. We don't allow ourselves any outside distractions. Crazy interesting to me that I'd given backseat rides to the Navy NASCAR team, and Brad Koslowski was the driver at the time, and he flew with me in a Blue Angel aircraft. He went on to win a number of races and become a very successful NASCAR driver. And we were at an event with him that spring after he'd flown with me, and we're on the track. He was racing that day, and NASCAR races are every bit as high stakes as flying an airplane around. It's a very dangerous thing. They're doing high speed, a lot of similarities. And he sat out there, all the drivers sit out there with sponsors, with fans, with whoever at the side of their car up until the moment they blow the whistle and they get in and they drive. And to me, it was so different than what we did, because we would never do that. We would only ever be in our group. Like I said, we minimize all the distractions. So that's how we prepare for it. Now, does one pilot maybe sit quietly in the moments before and close his eyes and goes through a few more things that they want to improve on for that day? Sure, that happens pretty routinely. But having a routine and minimize distractions, I think, is the best way that I found for us that we prepare for each of those shows. And I still use those techniques now. If I have to prepare for something, I'm for sure going to find time. I'm going to set aside time ahead of time. I'm going to remove my distractions, and I'm going to get in the right headspace before I go into something that requires some level of focus. And one final note, I think for sure it's life and death. It's high stakes when you're landing on the aircraft carrier flying an air show. But no matter what business we're in, you can find a corollary. If you're a single mom trying to sell real estate and you're living paycheck to paycheck, whatever that next deal pitch is, whatever that closing is, it feels life and death to that person in that moment. There's no doubt in my mind that, sure, they're not flying an airplane 3 feet off the runway and a quarter of a second away from dying, but that doesn't mean that they don't go to bed thinking that if I don't succeed tomorrow, my life looks very, very different.
Oh, no, I got you. I completely agree. But there's not any kind of, in addition to everything you just said, no special breathing techniques, no kind of self-talk, nothing you're doing to get yourself in the right mindset as you're entering. All of these things are sort of things that have happened leading up to that point, but right as you're about to do it, because certainly basketball players, you mentioned, shooting, there are certain things they'll do. Different ones do different things. You'll often see them wearing, headphones or listening to music. That might be what they need. Other people might be closing their eyes and meditating. I'm not saying there's a right answer for it. I just didn't know if there was any specific technique.
You did remind me, though, that that is I think yes to probably all of those things, but also each pilot has a very unique way of strapping into their aircraft. And they'll have a very set process they go through. And we only have 2 crew chiefs. You have an Alpha and a Bravo, and they alternate. But the crew chiefs get to know their pilot and their patterns really well. And so you might do your straps in a certain order. You might have almost like shooting free throws. Like you might, as you ratchet it down, you do everything the same way every time. And in doing so, it keeps you in this rhythm so that you are now able to be totally focused on what's going on. So I definitely think that applies.
Okay, this question is a bit out there. You've got a degree in mathematics, right?
I do.
Okay. Does an elite pilot like yourself, do you see a dogfight Do you see a landing on an aircraft carrier? Do you see an aero sequence as a set of like moving variables and equations, or is it all just instinctive to you?
I think it has to be the latter first. When you learn to fly an airplane, before it becomes instinctive, you have to first learn power settings. My children are learning to fly right now, and they're explaining what they're doing to me. And it was so long ago that I learned. They're saying, well, on the downwind, I fly this power setting, and I have to fly at this speed. And aviation is very much math-centric. I felt benefited because I felt like I was good at doing math. By the time you take Calc 8 or Calc 10 or whatever they made us do as a math major, you should be pretty comfortable with numbers. But so much of aviation, if we're flying a low-level route, we deliberately fly 420, 480, 540 because it divides by 6. And there's 60 seconds in a minute, 60 knots is this. And so you're constantly doing math. And so for sure, if you're in a dogfight, it becomes less math, but distance and closure rates and energy management. And so you have to apply some level of scientific rigor or mathematics to it to learn what to do. And then as you do it more and more, it becomes more instinct, more feel, and less rote memory or less hard numbers. It becomes more of an art than a science. But at first, it definitely has to be a science.
Do you miss the intensity? Do you miss the adrenaline rush? And have you been able to find something to replace it in some way, or have you just gotten over it?
I think I do miss it. And I wouldn't have thought that about myself until I stopped doing it. And I think that's manifests itself in basically different levels of frustration or lack of happiness to some degree that I might have had before. I never saw myself as an adrenaline junkie, although I think if someone were to try to evaluate me and say, well, your hobbies are flying fighters or skydiving or scuba diving or motorcycles or whatever, these are all stereotypical hobbies of an adrenaline junkie, but I never felt that way. And I kind of actually address it in the book a little bit, that when I went to meet the Blue Angels for the first time as an applicant, kind of curious as to who these people are and how the squadron works, I expected a bunch of cowboys. You're watching them fly down the runway 20, 50 feet off, these high G turns, you're expecting them to just be lighting their hair on fire. And in fact, what I found was like the most calm, cool, collected group of professionals I'd ever been around. And then you think, oh wait, that's a lot more powerful than someone who's just really comfortable in the airplane and just raging around this air show. To be that focused on I was going 680 miles per hour in front of this crowd at low altitude, but in that moment, I was just worried that I was 681, not 680, and I was flying a little bit faster than I should have been. That sort of thing, because you're just focused on flying this perfect air show. And so for me, when I leave that, I didn't anticipate. I still fly. I love to fly. It was one of the greatest gifts and blessings of my life that I failed into aviation, and I found a joy in something that I never thought I would have found. And so I live on a runway in North Georgia, and we can fly every day. And my children fly. I fly for work, and everything about it I love. There's not the same adrenaline, though, in flying a Gulfstream at 50,000 feet as there is in flying an F-18 at 10 feet. There just isn't. But I also think that it's a sport for young men and women. It's the sport of kings for sure. But when I went back to the Blue Angels after the mishap in 2016, I was in my late 30s, and the amount of grandpa jokes I got was like, "Hey, old man, who let the dinosaur in?" And that's fine. It is what it is. I mean, everything's relative. And someone who's 32 looking at someone who's 38, they feel like an old man, and it takes a toll on your body. It takes a real toll on your body, the high G and the high positive and negative Gs and that sort of thing, and the spring. So I don't miss it in the sense that I felt very privileged that I had the opportunity to do it multiple times. And I'm grateful for having had that opportunity. I'm grateful for having had the opportunity to do it safely. And so I don't miss it in that regard. But I do miss the excitement, for sure.
I mean, I guess you could kick off one of the engines in the Gulfstream just for fun, right? Just
for kicks. Yeah, exactly. That would, the airplanes nowadays, a guy I gave a backseat ride to, who was a film producer and a great guy, made an IMAX called Living in the Age of Airplanes. And he had Harrison Ford narrate it. And one of the lines is, aviation went from impossible to nearly perfected in a century. And it's so true. And it's nothing else that I can think of has had that level of learning and of growth in that short of a time period. And so there are a lot of pilots in the world right now who've never seen anything go wrong because aviation's so safe. And that's a good thing.
Let's see. I think it was maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I actually got my pilot's license.
Right on.
Single engine. not one, two near-death experiences. So one day over a bear, I'll share this with you. But I don't know how safe. Maybe it's me, and not the flying itself. But we'll end here, Frank. Which is the name of the podcast is The Art of Excellence, of course. That word excellence, I'd like my guest to define it. What does the word mean to you?
Pushing yourself, your team, your friends, your coworkers to a point that they didn't think they could achieve without being willing to try to do something they didn't think they were able to do, and being willing to fail and pick the pieces up and start over again more intelligently. I think that probably best defines excellence. You're achieving something, you're putting a measured standard to something that you didn't think was possible without being willing to push yourself past your comfort zone.
Well, I'll take it. Sold.
Right on.
Fantastic. Loved it. I should have mentioned, I've been a huge Blue Angel fan my entire life. And I've seen a number of shows. I think my favorite one was when my now wife and I were dating at the time, engaged, San Francisco. And watching those fly, I felt like I could reach up and almost grab one of the wings. They're flying so close to the buildings and over the water, and all. It was just so beautiful and mesmerizing to watch. But
do you remember what year that was?
Oh gosh, this would have been somewhere in the mid to late 90s. I wouldn't remember. I think there were a couple shows that I watched, and we could literally climb up on our roof and watch the whole show. It was fantastic. And just the noise, just the sound of the engines just sort of blew me away. But I know we barely scraped the surface on all that you've done, but loved it. Loved every part of it. Fantastic book.
Thank you.
Would recommend it to anyone, everyone. And really nice to meet you. Really appreciate you spending time with me and my audience, Frank.
Likewise. Thanks for having me on.